Okay, we will dive in. Welcome to our annual webinar. Each year at the end of an admissions cycle, we dive in and try to understand what's going on, what happened, what just happened after we spend time with students and college admissions directors. This webinar will be recorded and we'll share the recording with all of you in a follow-up note tomorrow, as well as some of the resources that we mention. A couple of housekeeping notes. We'd love to have you ask questions in the Q&A box. We're all used to webinars, so I don't think that'll be unusual, but we find it pretty easy then to make sure we can manage it. This webinar is particularly popular with people's questions, and some of them may be so student specific that we actually can't answer them in the sort of time or space allowed. We'd like to say hello from College Matchpoint. Lisa, do you want to greet everybody who's joining us today?
Yes, hello, and thank you for joining us. This is always a fun webinar to kind of look backwards and see the trends that we've seen. And I'm Lisa Carlton, the founder of College Matchpoint. And Bob's already introduced himself. And then Allison Randall is our managing director and one of our wonderful educational consultants. So we're excited to have you with us and share what we have learned this year.
We've been doing this for 15 years. I think that gives us a fair amount of wisdom, but it also gives us a perspective that we're in a part of life, and as a result, college admissions, where it's hard to figure out the new normal. Every year seems like the next normal. We keep on wondering when things are going to reset, but we've been lucky enough to work with students that have frankly been admitted to hundreds of different schools. And the number of schools, yes, they include highly selected colleges, and we'll talk about them today, but we are really obsessed with the fact that the name of the college, while it's so important sometimes, is so much less important than where the student will thrive. What they're gonna do in college, not just where they go in college. And so we always say to families and students, yes, the name brand is great. Yes, shooting for the star is wonderful. But as Allison always says, make sure you're in the right galaxy. Make sure you're thinking about thriving in college, not just the t-shirt you're gonna wear where you proudly state where you're going to college. So we just wanna stress before we dive into data after data after data, we just wanna stress to you that we profoundly believe that there are 3,000 schools that students should and could choose from, and that is the most important part of college list development. Now, having made that proviso, our agenda for today, there are some core trends that we've noticed. We'll try to go through them, not just qualitatively, but quantitatively, to give you a flavor and a sense of this past class, the high school class of 2023, and what we saw in terms of trends. We'll then turn our attention to the implications of those trends for students' journey to college. That might be a rising junior, a rising sophomore, a rising freshman. Heck, it might even be interesting to a parent of an 8th or 9th grader that already has the journey to college on their radar. Okay, let's start with a little focus on the trends themselves. The first trend that we've seen, honestly, is a trend that we've seen for the past couple of years, and it just keeps sticking around, and that is application inflation, which made admissions much more competitive for many, many students. To give you a sense of that, the Common Application, the platform that receives applications that the largest percentage of schools in the US utilize, they report 1.6 million more applications this year than 3 years ago. Now, the high school class size didn't grow. So what we're seeing is that inflation And that inflation is disproportionately coming from students adding more reach schools to their list. You can see it on this graphic. It may be a little hard for those of us that have glasses, but what it's saying is that while the schools that have admissions rates under 20% are relatively small, they're receiving a disproportional number of the applications that students are submitting. And the number of schools that students have on their college list has also exploded over the last 3 years. 3 years ago, the average student typically had 5 schools on her list. This season, the typical student had 7 schools on their list. And that growth was driven in large part by higher income students and significantly by students adding those reach schools. Those of you that are joining us on this webinar from the state of Texas, it is the second largest state level increase over the last 3 years. Thank God for South Carolina, it's number 1. But over the last 3 years, the Common App reports that students in Texas, the gross number of applications, and it is a sort of a gross number, increased by 69% from students who were in high schools in the state of Texas. Now, that growth in applications, as we said, is really impacting highly selective schools. If you take the subset of the most selective schools as a group, they've seen a 43% increase in the number of applications they received. So you can look at sort of this murderer's row of colleges. These are, for parents that are on this webinar, sort of the colleges that oftentimes we have in mind, that we talk to friends about. They're certainly the name brands. And these schools have really seen changes over the last 3 years. And we picked some of the more common schools, the schools that receive the more significant volume of applications. As an example, UCLA is officially high school students in America's favorite school. 180,000 students applied to UCLA last year. You can see over a 3-year period that in many cases, the admit rate dropped in half. USC from 16% to 8%. You can see a school like BU go from 18 to 11%. Then you can see schools like NYU and UCLA, both big city schools that are super popular with kids across the country, and their admissions rate really, really dropped as a result of more students putting those schools on their college list as reach schools. Lisa, before we turn our attention to some of the other trends, are there any comments you want to make either about application inflation or about what you see in terms of how it's impacting highly selective schools?
Well, I would say that, the 7 applications, of course, most of us are seeing kids doing something, sometimes having students who want to do 25 schools or just, this insane number of schools, thinking that that's going to up their probability. And if you go back to this slide, I think one of the things, which is understandable because we've really seen such a sharp decline in a short amount of time, right? Where many of these are, just about cut in half or, at least, a nice third off of it, is it's really hard as a society to go, well, Boston University is not that hard to get into. And it's like, yes, it actually is, And so I think that one of the things that we're seeing happen is it's kind of hard for families to catch up with this new world order, because as Bob said, it's just sort of kind of continuing. I would say this year was, a difficult year in admissions, just like the other last few years have been, like, with a few little nuances in it. But I think one of the things we're seeing that's hard for families as they're crafting lists is how to digest this, I guess. It's like, oh, well, And it's like, how do you communicate? 8% means 92% did not get in. And probably the vast majority of that pool is RA students, so I think it's hard for families to kind of digest this and kind of understand the new world order of college admissions and what looks like a balanced college list.
There's a couple of great questions have come in. Bob, do you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead.
Okay. One is, does this application inflation change the kinds of students that are getting accepted? Meaning, are there more qualified applicants as these increases happen? Or like, what has changed about the kids who get in?
Let me jump on those both because they're both such great questions. So colleges do not release, hey, we got, as an example, UT Austin got 66,000 applications last year. They don't release, hey, while we got the most applications that we've ever gotten, only 8,000 of them were qualified students. Okay, so it's hard to look into this and predict just how much of the change is students adding reaches that really were extreme reaches that they're only considering adding because that school is test optional. As a context, 95% of schools in the United States are test optional. Last year, 44% of students submitted a test score. 3 years ago, 98% of students submitted a test score. It's one of the biggest sea changes. So some students who are great qualified students, but in the past might have stopped to apply to that REACH school because they had a test score way outside of range. Well, they've added that to their college list. It's still a REACH, but they don't have a test score that's excluding them from what one might call a targeted list of qualified applicants. They're both really great questions. To piggyback on Lisa's comment, this is something really hard to get your head around. This is a change in the last 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. This is from the data a year ago. We don't anticipate that any of these schools listed got quote unquote any easier, right? So you see these sort of jaw-dropping trends where you really have to trust these admissions directors when they say, I could have populated, honestly, 3 more schools with kids who barely missed. They're just really, really incredible applicant pools that these schools are getting from a academic point of view.
And I would add one thing there, Bob, is that and it kind of goes back to the question that the person asked, is I think colleges are, thinking about their institutional priorities. What are the values and the priorities that they have? And so I think that is also impacting the students that colleges choose. And therefore, that's not the same thing with every single college, because every college has different priorities and how they're trying to grow their campus.
We've got 2 great questions here, and I'm gonna try to tackle them as we go. And thanks everybody for jumping in and being so curious. Boy, it seems to be a media contest right now. It's really popular in April, May, and June to write articles about the kid who applied to 60 schools. They got $7 million in scholarships. And Heather makes a great point. And we always say to students, and this is a sort of a funny thing to observe, if you go back to this listing, if you added them up, this is 103% if you add all these statistics. Some students say, well, if I just apply to all those schools, my odds of getting in are 103%. And the answer is no. A 9% admit rate at Cornell is a 9% admit rate. While students may be applying to more selective and highly selective schools, the admit rate is the admit rate. In point of fact, they may just be giving themselves more opportunities to hear a no from a school.
And then there's one other question that I wanted to answer, which was about legacy admissions, because I think that's such a question. And I have a horrible answer. It depends. We've seen colleges that have shut down legacy admissions. They no longer look at legacy. And there's definitely colleges where, Duke, UVA, places where they definitely look strongly at a legacy. So I think that there's not, unfortunately, a one answer. It depends on the college. I think there's been a push to try to kind of lessen the impact of legacy admissions, but I don't think we're really seeing that across the board. And of course, big state schools most of them don't take it into account. So it's really a school by school basis.
Mary has a question that we're just going to try to hit real quick, and it's such a great question. Does it mean that more students are applying or more kids are adding reach schools? The size of the high school classes in aggregate in the United States has not changed significantly over the last 3 years. So it isn't like there are 200,000 more high school seniors this year than there were 3 years ago. That's a flat number. So these kids are applying to more schools, and either fortunately or unfortunately, and we think it's probably unfortunately, they're adding more rich schools to their list, as opposed to adding more possibles or targets. Now, one of the most surprising things for parents who applied to college themselves 20, 25, 30 years ago is the shift in how you would determine selectivity. This is a chart that takes a minute to both get your eyes used to, and then takes a minute to catch up to the actual implications. One column is the schools in 2003, 20 years ago. The other column is the equivalent school this year that had the exact same admit rate. 20 years ago, Harvard's admit rate was 15%. This year, that's Notre Dame. 20 years ago, Columbia's admit rate was 16%. That's Georgia Tech. And that's Georgia Tech's overall, their out-of-state admit rate is substantially below that. Dartmouth is the equivalent admit rate 20 years later of what Florida State is. And then Texas A&M, there are a number of folks on this webinar today that are from the great state of Texas. Overall, the UT admit rate was 32% last year. That was Cornell 20 years ago. And there's a big asterisk next to UT Austin, which we'll tackle in just a minute. But as Lisa mentioned before, the highlight for me as a parent is I still have in my head Georgia Tech 20 years ago, Florida State 20 years ago, and I haven't caught up with the equivalency of what Harvard was 20 years ago in terms of the difficulty of getting in is now Notre Dame. So sometimes when I look at a kid's list, I'm like, oh, it can't be that hard. And then I have to look at the number. And as one of the valedictorians at a technical high school in Texas mentioned me today, math is math. That 15% admit rate is a 15% admit rate. Now, they're different by schools. Sometimes they really have done some things to increase the number of applications, but it's super helpful to have this in your head as you adjust your own history of how hard you think a school is to get in versus the current reality. Now,
and can I answer a question real quick? Because I think it's such an important question. So Jennifer asked, basically, I'm gonna, why does it hurt to apply to a bunch of reach schools? Like, what's the harm? If you've got your match schools and you've got that, and you want to add, however many more match schools, what's the harm? And I, as someone who's done this a long time, has to say, I think there is some harm. At some level, like if you add 4 to 5 more, I don't know that there's a harm. But I see these students who add all of these colleges, and then that's an enormous amount of work. And then they always say that it's not going to upset them, but getting that many rejections, I haven't seen many students that didn't have an impact on. So I guess, is there a harm? I think it's the value of time. And I think it's what it can do to the student's kind of emotional state. And then is that kind of, is it worth it, I guess? And so there certainly are kids that do that, and that works. My experience with that has mostly been that it ends up being a negative when it goes too far. So when it starts to be, let's add 10, let's add 12, I think adding a little in there, if that's somewhere. And then I think shooting for the stars is fine if you're really in the pool, and we'll talk about that. But shooting for the stars when one doesn't have those things, I think for a whole bunch of schools, really sets a student up for something that might not be healthy.
We've talked about the what, we just want to flash the why. We mentioned test optional. We are in a moment where colleges are aggressively marketing to students at what one might think is the top of the funnel. They want to do everything they can do to get the maximum number of applications so that they can click into this cultural norm. And that is, the more competitive the school, the more attractive it is to some kids. So it's a vicious cycle. And it is a vicious cycle that's influenced by what Lisa just said. And that is, hey, it's fine if you apply to 25 schools, just so you know, those extra schools are going to overall most likely end up having lower admit rates, which is just going to viciously make them much more attractive to the next set of kids. Now, we highlighted this before. The University of Texas at Austin is now a highly selective school for many students who apply there. This gives you a sense of the number of applications that UT has received over the last 20 years and what that's done to the admit rate. Those of you that are in the state of Texas, you're probably aware the secret is out. In a recent survey that Princeton Review did, the University of Texas at Austin was the 8th most popular school in the United States among high school students. And you can see it in the growth in the number of applications. Now, the reason we put an asterisk next to that 32% admit rate is the distinction between auto admit and non-auto admit. For the students who applied to UT Austin and were not in the top 6% of their class, the admit rate was 12%. So again, remember, in the UT world of admissions, there's auto admit, you're in the top 6%. You're not guaranteed admissions, but you're guaranteed a slot at the College of Liberal Arts at UT. And then there's non-auto admit. For non-auto admit, you're competing for 25% of the seats in an incoming class. And in that candidate pool, the admit rate was 12%. Now, families often ask this. UT Austin is very clear that they take an approach that is very key to a student's major and an idea of fit to major. They unfortunately do not share admit rates by major. Qualitatively, we know that the more STEM majors, business, nursing, architecture, those are what UT calls impacted majors. They don't have enough seats for the number of students who apply. So for those of you that have students that are considering UT Austin, if they're not in the top 6%, they probably should think of it as a highly selective school. And even if they are in the top 6%, if they're going for a competitive major, that major at UT Austin might also be highly selective. Lisa, I know you've looked at a lot of this data for UT. Are there any other comments you want to add to this sort of snapshot of where UT is right now from an admissions point of view?
Well, I think that UT is, for those of you that are from Texas, and for those of you who are not, sorry, we're going to just do this for 1 second. I do think one of the things about UT Austin is, if the student is a strong student, that 12% number can scare you. And I would encourage you, if you really are, if you're really interested, to apply, because we do see a lot of our students getting in. So while the number is low, if you have a good fit to major and you've taken, solid classes and you've gotten good grades, I wouldn't totally let that number scare you away, because I often call UT a wild card. It's so hard to know what they're going to do, and they change their priorities like so often that one way the wind's blowing this way, and then one way the wind's blowing that way. And so it is a school that I think you just have to apply to, knowing that if you're not in the top 6%, nothing is guaranteed. I often hear students in Texas saying, "Oh, I'm going to put UT on as my safety," and I'm like, well, we can't do that. Having UT on is a great idea, but having it as a safety is probably not really for anyone. And that does mean anyone, because one year all of the students that we had with 36s on the ACT didn't get in. I mean, like, we've seen so many different waves that it's hard to kind of know their priorities each year. So that would be my only thing about UT.
Now, we mentioned at UT the real differences between the students' first choice major. The last several years have seen a shift to what we increasingly think of as highly selective majors. We mentioned them when we were talking about UT. These can oftentimes be biology programs or physical science programs. They obviously are business at many schools. Computer science at a school like UT or Carnegie Mellon can be more competitive even than an Ivy League school. Engineering, nursing, and then the accelerated programs like a BSMD, they really ought to be thought of as highly selective majors. To give you a context for this, there has been a substantial growth in the number of undergraduate degrees over the last 10 years. Colleges are offering more and more degree programs: data science, artificial information, health and society. Having said that, 52% of students are concentrated in 3 fields of study: business, biology and health related, engineering, and computer science. And those STEM majors, well, frankly, they've just exploded over the last 10 years, an almost 60% increase in the number of STEM degrees conferred over the last 10 years. So the good news is, like we said at the beginning, there's not just 3,000 options for kids, there's thousands of degree options for kids. But we are in a moment where the degrees that are chosen are really so impacted that you have these highly selective majors that have begun to be more and more difficult for even the most academically accomplished students to reach towards. Lisa,
And so as an
turn our-
example, as an example, like if you think about the University of Washington in Seattle, which has a 40% acceptance rate, but their CS program has a single digit, So I think sometimes we're looking only at the top number of the school. And it's hard because, like Bob said, many schools don't let out the numbers on their majors. But the other thing I would highlight here is that we have seen a really strong uptick in the competitiveness of business in the last 2 cycles, for sure, maybe 3. And so we're seeing that students really need to go through calculus for business. They really need to have background in business. So that was a major which used to sometimes be thought of, well, if you weren't going to do engineering or computer science, you could do business. But now what we're seeing, as Bob's saying about these highly selective majors, is that business is also becoming one. So the important point here is not to get lured into the overall acceptance rate of some, especially these big state schools, when sometimes that major is significantly more competitive than what you're reading as the overall acceptance rate. And I would say the reverse of this is true too. Sometimes you can look at a school like, I'll use Boulder as an example. People are like, oh, Boulder's a safety school, but yet their business school is rated pretty darn high. And to get direct admit into the business school, it's not insanely competitive, but it's not insanely easy either. So I think that plays kind of on both sides of the acceptance wheel, if you will. And so this is a factor that we see becoming more and more of a factor in admissions decisions.
One other trend that we want to make sure we flag is that a larger percentage of students every year decide to choose what is called the early decision option or restricted early action. And that's translated to a much higher use of deferrals or wait lists. 38% of high income students apply to one school on their list, either early decision or restricted early action. Again, as a reminder, you only have one early decision card to play, very different from early action.
Well, you could do early decision one or early decision, like you can only do one at a time, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And schools have really utilized this as, frankly, a marketing tool. And they afford a much more a much higher admit rate when a student will apply early decision, and many schools will fill 50 to 60% of their incoming class through early decision. We note here, and we'll be sending these slides as a follow-up, that the source for this is a commentator named Jeff Slingo, who had what one would call sort of a searing op-ed piece about the use of early decision as a marketing tool by colleges and universities. We've shared here a summary graph. This data comes from a colleague of ours, Big J Consulting, Jeff Levy and Jenny Canton. Every August, they publish their statistics for early decision and how they compare to the regular decision admit rate. And you can see some of these schools like Tulane, Vandy, that have really leaned into early decision. The multiplier here is, what does the ED admit rate, the early decision admit rate, look like compared to the regular decision admit rate? And you can see some of these that in some ways almost change the category of the school for some students. Lisa, before we move on from ED and the way it's become so prominent for a class of students, are there any comments you want to make about ED?
I think you pretty much said it. As a consultant, I always say to my students, only ED somewhere that you want to go because you're committing to going there, right? And so I think that this data sometimes can be kind of enticing, right? Because it significantly can up your chances at places, but that's only great if it's a place that you're going to love to go and a place that you really like, as well or better than your other choices. And I always like students to see those schools before they would make that decision. We are seeing ED2. We've seen a little bit of an increase in ED2 over the last few years. And so early decision 1 is typically a November 1 deadline, and ED2 is usually January 1st-ish, around there. So there is the opportunity for students who are really trying to get strategic and maybe have 2 schools that have ED to kind of apply to one and know they're going to apply to the other. And I would say we still have many students who don't apply early decision because they're not ready to make a binding decision that early in the season. And so I think that's a really important family conversation to have. There's certainly opportunity in ED. The other thing to remember in your ED numbers is that you've got your athletes, you've got your legacy. So while the numbers look enticing when you start playing with the numbers, there is some other factors in there. So I'm not saying that it doesn't give you a bump, but I'm saying there are other factors at play. So it's important to know that as well. Certainly ED can be a good option for certain students.
And Lisa, we had a question about the percentage of accepted class that's ED. Just to confirm that is the percentage of the incoming class that was early decision?
Absolutely.
Yes, right.
If you see a school like Tulane, 60% of their incoming class was admitted through early decision. Lisa, there's a question here about a little more understanding of ED1 versus ED2.
So they're just 2 different dates, right? So one is, are you ready to commit at the beginning of November? No. conventional wisdom is that ED1 is a you're going to get a bigger bump for it. Okay, there are not numbers posted about ED2, so we don't really know. So I do think one can infer that there is a bump still at ED2, but definitely ED1 is the biggest bump. But I think there's a lot of reasons that sometimes students at maybe in November aren't ready, but by January or a little bit later, you know, they're ready to commit. Then it's like, wait, I've really thought about this. Or maybe sometimes what happens, a big tactic that colleges are using right now is well, gosh, we're deferring you, but please feel free to apply early decision 2. So they're kind of nudging you, like, if you really want to get in our school, you're going to need to commit to us. So there's a lot of that goes on as well. So that's sometimes a movement towards ED2.
We're going to keep going. We've got a good amount of questions on ED, and in our follow-up note, we'll share a resource to allow you to dive a little deeper into ED. We mentioned before that more schools are utilizing deferrals and wait lists. It's frankly been across different types of schools. Wisconsin deferred a large percentage of their applying class. And then as a result, one thing that I think can sometimes be one of the most difficult situations for a senior is that they get waitlisted at a school that is their quote unquote #1 school, and the waitlist admit rate continues to go down. So it's almost a deferred no. Some schools have been more sensitive and have tried to say, let's try to give you a hard yes or no. But we are seeing more and more schools managing application inflation and managing yield, how many students actually end up dorm depositing and then showing up, by utilizing wait lists and deferrals. We alluded to this before. Test optional is the rule of the universe right now. Fewer students submitted test scores. One repercussion of that, for those of you that are math nerds on this webinar, is that the average test score has gone up because kids self-select, and if they have a test score, they're in that test score that they love, they typically are in that 48% who submit. And if they don't love it, or it's not as strong as they are academically, they don't submit it. So we've seen the bell curve, the overall test score average, increase over the last 3 years. Now, a couple of other trends that we just want to highlight. The first is an amplification of a trend that we've seen over the last several years, and that is that teams that are successful in sports tend to see application inflation. Now, it's easy to look at this almost from a regional point of view, if you will. Oh, that's just a Southern thing or a Texas thing. This is a online article from this past October from Town and Country magazine. To be frank, I didn't even realize that Town and Country magazine still existed, but their headline says it all. Why are more and more Northern kids heading to the South for college? A quote in it said that TCU is now the new popular school for kids in Boston and New York and Philly and DC. Now, they may be overstating it because magazines tend to have a desire to do that. But what we've seen is one case study, the Tennessee Volunteers, who in one day saw 4,000 applications from out of state. Their out of state applications overall increased by 51%, and their out of state admit rate dropped in half. Talk about a school that historically families might have thought of as a quote unquote slam dunk. Tennessee's a great football team, not so good at basketball. They'd see it as a touchdown. It's now a very competitive school for out-of-state students. And Tennessee themselves has pointed to the increase in applications driven by a great school, and Tennessee is a great school, getting on kids' radar screens because they excelled athletically. Now, one of the things that we want to do is, while numbers are important, there's some qualitative trends that really showed up when we did our deep dive on the results. Lisa, do you want to give a sense of what you're seeing in terms of these qualitative results, starting with fit to major?
Sure, absolutely. So these are a few trends, and most of them have been going on, but some I felt like I saw even more this year than other years. And one is activities that show fit to major. So this has, we, again, because we're based in Texas, we're sort of used to this from UT, but we really hadn't seen that as much across the country as we're seeing now, about the students having activities that show their intellectual interests. And I think this are their career interests, something that shows the college kind of what they're actually interested in from an academic standpoint. And so this is hard for kids because many of them are still trying to figure out what they want to study, and some are, maybe have multiple things that they want to study. And you can work that out with your activities. If you have a few things that you like, you can mix things up and do some interesting ways at that. But the student that I saw really having trouble this year is that straight A student, good test score, plays a couple sports, does a little bit of volunteer work, had a summer job, but there wasn't a lot of story in there, right? They're just like a good all-American kid. And so I think it was hard for those students where the college can't kind of read into what they're interested in and what's important to them. That was tough this year for sure.
One of the other things, Lisa, that I think we've seen is your analysis of transcript never being more important. Could you maybe unpack that for the folks who joined us today?
Yeah, I think obviously one's grades and one's rigor have always mattered in college admissions. But I think when we dovetail this with with test optional, this becomes even more important. And I think that really admissions staff, Bob gave that stat about, 40-something% of students apply with a test score. I think what's happened in admissions is they've gotten really curious and digging into what's the rigor of the students' coursework, what courses did they choose? Do those things make sense? That's another way to show fit to major is in coursework. So it doesn't always have to be in activities. Although I would say some activities are going to be important to be competitive, but the transcript has never been more important. And being able to explain a transcript, let's say that a student maybe had a weak freshman year, really want to be able to tell the story of that in your application. What admissions officers tell us is that if you don't tell them what happened, then they have to kind of imagine what happened, and they're just going to think maybe you didn't try or whatever. So really important to explain anything that happens in a transcript. But I do think grades, I've always said grades are the main enchilada, and I think they're really the main enchilada now. Yeah.
For those of you that do have UT Austin on your list, when kids ask us, what's the thing I could do to increase my odds of getting into UT Austin? The obvious answer is obviously, if you're in the state of Texas, rank in the top 6% of your school academically. The last thing, Lisa, is this thing that I think sometimes falls off the radar screen for so many parents and students, and that is leadership and character. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of these admissions results?
Well, I think we all know that, in a post-COVID world, kids struggled. I mean, all of us struggled socially, right? In terms of we lost some skills in social connection and working and living in communities and giving back. So one of the things that we see colleges try, and many of them have their own kind of internal scorecard on this, but what they're really looking at is Is this a student I would want to be a roommate with someone else? Can they be in a club and get along? Can they handle it if someone else doesn't agree with them? The kinds of things that are important to build a good community, right? And so colleges are looking at that by, one of the things is in the activity. Are there activities that students do where they're interacting with other people, where they're leading other people? Are they giving back to their community? Do they do things in their community that they leave after they're there because that makes their community better? Do their essays or their letters of rec mention character? But these factors I think are really important. And I might add one in here too, which is also resilience. Kids who have shown resilience, so maybe they had some kind of dip or something. Now I'm not talking huge major dip, but you know, I had a few students this year who had you know, maybe a little bumpier transcripts, but they were able to explain it, and then they had a nice big surge up, and they overperformed in my opinion. And so I think that colleges are looking at the human beings behind these applications, and that does feel obvious to me in a lot of the in the decisions. And this ability to be a good community member really can't be underestimated. And it's also, it's one of the healthier things I think colleges are doing, because what's better than for us to all be trying to help our students learn to be giving back and being good community members. And so I think we're going to continue to see this, given many of the crisis that teens are having right now, that this is going to be a factor in admissions going forward.
So we've just gone through the data of this year. Now what we want to do is spend the last 10 minutes talking through the implications of this data. If your student is a rising senior or junior or freshman, or honestly, even a 8th or 9th grader where you have this on your radar, we want to help you understand this shouldn't trigger fear, uncertainty, and doom. There are some implications that you can have in mind to make sure that these results don't increase stress. Now, one of the things we've seen from students who thrive in this process is that it's self-driven. We always joke that mom and dad, college counselor, friends, they can't be ushers. This isn't Google Maps. This isn't a sense of if you turn here and here and here. Now, some kids enjoy a competitive process, and there are certainly plenty of schools for those kids. But frankly, we see more and more students tapping out of that and saying, I just don't want to buy into that. I'm burned out from that from high school, and I don't want to keep up at this. And then one of the most heartening trends over the last 3 years has been seeing kids who are motivated of themselves to really dive deeper into a topic. We love talking to kids when they tell us about their most recent deep dive. Now, Lisa, when you think about an application in the context of these admissions results, what are the things that you feel like that application should communicate?
Well, I think that obviously at the center, as we said, is always your academic rigor. So that's your transcript. That's how hard at classes did you take? Did you go outside to take any other things because you were, just interested in it? I think everyone doesn't necessarily going to ace all of these. I want to be honest, right? Like some students really read amazing on intellectual curiosity, but they really haven't done that much for the community yet. Okay. So I think but in a perfect world, we want this to kind of play together. So my favorite thing is when I can make common good, fit to major, and intellectual curiosity all work together. That's when we're really cooking. So for example, if a student, like today, I was talking to a student who is it has a particular major that they're interested in, and they're actually going to be doing research on that major. But this summer, they're going to be volunteering in that to learn a little bit more about it. That's going to feed into the research they're doing at their independent project, which leads into that fit to major. I think for students, that provides an amazing experience, absent what the application communicates, but also really becomes a more unique combination, because then you're taking these multiple strands, putting them together, that starts to only look like that student could have done that. So I think when we're kind of looking at what we dream of an application looking like, that would be our hope.
Now, in terms of an academic profile, because we're sensitive to the fact that we're coming close to the turn of the hour, you really are looking at students that have chosen the most rigorous classes, they've gotten high A's, and that if they have B's, frankly, those B's have come early in their high school career.
And just to put an asterisk on that, that's for students who are looking at highly selective schools. So the schools that we have been doing, because the deep dive is all admissions. So I just want to asterisk that there certainly are many schools students with all B's and C's can get into.
Chris Watson at Northwestern has this great quote about how intellectual curiosity communicates to them. Not only is the student a great applicant, but they'd be a great student and a great alumni from that school. Lisa, this idea of a college crafting a class, which can feel very different from a student submitting an application. Can you maybe give a minute or two overview on how a family should think about this idea of a college crafting a class?
Well, I think it's important to understand this, because I think the common thing is when a student doesn't get in, often a parent will call and say, what did they do wrong? My hunch is they often didn't do anything wrong. They just may not have fit the priorities. For example, if we look at population growth, colleges are trying to hit areas that have high population growth because they want to get more students from those areas. So it could be that students in those areas might have an easier time getting in than, say, somewhere else. That's just one example. Not every college is doing that. Some schools might decide they want to have a more diverse campus because their campus is not very diverse. Some schools might decide that they want to have more diversity of opinion. Some schools have things that they've already committed to. For example, I think an admissions officer once explained that some people donated money and that opened up slot. So you never know all the things that are going on behind the scenes that impact admissions, right? So what is important to know is that you can't change the institutional priorities of a college, right? All you can do is have the best application you can have. But I think as consumers of college, it's important to understand that, it's not just this student versus, there's a lot of factors that are going into this puzzle besides just this student's piece of information. Okay. And I think that helps as you kind of ponder, because I think one of the things we've seen in admissions as a trend that we didn't really talk about is that it's erratic right now. That's what I would call it, erratic. So we see surprises this way, we see surprises that way. So yes, I think that that it is important to understand the institutional priorities.
A couple of things in terms of a student's extracurriculars that either show up on their activity summary or at some schools on their resume. There are a whole host of schools, fabulous schools, where they're looking for students who are broad. They've been involved in a lot of things that they're interested in. What's heartening to see is as kids get older in high school, some of them really take initiative, they step in. And then there are some of those kids, and Lisa mentioned this in terms of community impact, who really look at making a lasting difference in the communities that they're a part of. Lisa, at some of the more highly selective schools, at those schools that have an admit rate below 10%, can you give a sense of what initiative and impact actually means for those schools?
Well, I think that it's a student engaging at a state, a national, international level, or a student solving problems. And like I said earlier, wanting to leave a legacy. Students engaging in a multi-year projects. I think, you know, the independent research has become popular. And, you know, I always say the independent research, like there's a lot of paid independent research out there right now, which I think is a, you know, a phenomenal way for students to start exploring their interests. I think it's one way. I don't think it's certainly the only way, but I don't think that in and of itself is enough. I think it's what does the student do with that? What are they, after they've dug in and actually studied something, how does that move them to solve problems, to leave a legacy? So I think that is really, that's really where kind of those higher level things come in. It's a, you know, you've got to have a robust resume for those kind of schools.
We've got about 5 more minutes left, so we're going to actually skip a couple of slides, but we do really want to highlight this. So at the beginning of this webinar, we highlighted that there are 3,000 great schools, and don't just get obsessed with what Lisa calls the drool schools, okay? We want to come back to that and tell you, balanced list, balanced list, balanced list. We have some students and families that we work with who tell us, okay, we've heard you. You've repeated this over and over again. And our answer is, we couldn't possibly repeat it over enough. And what we've seen is that if a student can be firmly grounded in her possible list, then figuring out which of the reaches she wants to apply to or what matches she wants her list to include are relatively easy. But if they start by planting themselves on the reach side of their school, on the reach side of their list, their possibles and matches just feel so much less exciting. So our advice, go ahead.
Sorry. One thing I would add here for parents that I think you can really do in this environment to help your students. You know, it's very typical that when families go on college visits, they start out with the, you know, they all go to Boston and see, you know, which is great. That's fine. But I really implore you to spend some time talking to your students about their possibles and their matches, because what we find is that students don't spend enough time with those. And one possibility is that they could, not what we hope, but it could end up going to one of those. So as a family, I'd love for you guys to consider possibly having that conversation, include the whole list, not just the top of the list. And I think you're going to do your student a favor, because you want to make sure that that whole list fits the student, right? That's really important.
I do want to click on one thing before we leave this slide, and that is, oftentimes families will say to us, are there really any possibles left? And the answer is, look, ignore the hype for a little bit. The majority of those 3,000 schools that are wonderful, the majority of those majors that are fabulous are possibles. It is too hard to get sucked into the vortex, the sort of college admissions military industrial complex, and think the only thing that's important is reach. The numbers support that the majority of kids in the United States will go to a possible or a match school, and they will thrive. And the question becomes, what are the possibles that excite them versus the possibles that disappoint them? Now, as we mentioned, we're going to click through some slides. We are going to send these to you as a follow-up note, but because students, many of the rising seniors, are starting to turn their attention to essays, in the next couple of minutes left, Lisa or Allison, do you want to give just a moment of advice for those parents of students who are beginning to tackle the essays for their college applications?
Allison, you wanted to go?
You bet. So one of the things that I think it's a myth that a lot of students feel like that their college essay has to be about what we call a neon moment, or something like a really, like the biggest challenge they've ever faced that was maybe traumatic. Not the case. The personal statement is really the opportunity for the admissions folks to get to know the students. It's more like an interview than it is like a cover letter. And it doesn't have to be something that has never happened to anyone else. The key to the story isn't even in fact the story itself, but the student's take on the story, the student's reflection on what that moment. Some of the best essays that we have read at College Matchpoint involve kind of mundane things that the student done. Like, we had an amazing essay about a student who wrote about how he barbecued with his grandfather, and another one wrote about what he thought about when he mowed lawns in the summer. So it's really about the student having an opportunity to share something that isn't visible or readily available in the other parts of the application, so that the admissions team can really see who they're adding to their school community when they admit that student. And I like to tell my students, we want to make it easy for them to see what's going to be missing if they don't accept you. Lisa, you want to add anything else?
No, I think that you nailed it. Thank you.
We are so grateful to spend an hour with all of you talking through this year's results. We wish your students a low stress, actually enjoyable journey to college, a college where they thrive, and a college where honestly they look back at the end of their freshman year and think, I'm a better student for having gone through an intentional process. There are so many great options. And our advice to all of you is to let those options excite your students, as opposed to feeling overwhelmed by 10 to 20 schools that really make up statistically the outlier of the great colleges in the United States. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of the day, and we hope your June is fabulous.